Hi, I'm Neil Kelleher. This is part 2 in a series of videos on the transverse abdominis muscle. So in this video I'll talk about how the transverse abdominis can be useful in breathing, working with the respiratory diaphragm. I'll talk about how it can affect the overlying abdominal muscles, how via those muscles it can help control the relationship between the ribcage and the pelvis. I'll also talk about how it can have a positive effect on your knees as well as your lower back. So let's get on with it. What is the transverse abdominis? It's a belt-like muscle that runs across the front of the pelvis, around the space between the pelvis and the ribcage, and across the front of the ribcage. So when active or when activated, it actually contracts and pulls the waist inwards. And note, there is a way that you can pull the waist inwards by lifting the rib cage and actually sucking the belly in. This isn't quite the same thing. Using the transverse abdominis or activating it, the appearance or the look of it is actually pulling the belly in. And just to differentiate, it's not hardening the belly using the obliques or the rectus abdominis. It's simply pulling the belly in past the border of the rib cage and the hip bones. One idea you can get about the transverse abdominis is it's a muscle that works in coordination with the respiratory diaphragm. You can use a transverse abdominis to pull the belly in, and at the same time that will cause the respiratory diaphragm to press upwards, reducing lung volume. Or you can use the respiratory diaphragm to press downwards, causing the belly to expand and thus stretching the transverse abdominis and thus increasing lung volume. So the transverse abdominis, one of the muscles that the transverse abdominis works with is the respiratory diaphragm, and that's one of the reasons why it's a very useful muscle for breathing. The transverse abdominis is the innermost layer of the abdominal. So on top of the transverse abdominis, or lying above the transverse abdominis, you have the internal obliques, which run more or less down and back from the ribcage to the hip bone. You also have the external obliques, which run forward and down from the ribs to the hip bone. And then you have the rectus abdominis, which runs from the front of the ribcage down to the pubic symphysis, so the six-pack. So the transverse abdominis lies beneath all of these muscles, but effectively it might as well be above the muscles, because when the transverse abdominis pulls inwards, when you actively activate your transverse abdominis and shorten it so that it pulls the belly inwards, it pulls the overlying muscles with it. So what good is that? It's a simple way, using transverse abdominis activation is a simple way of adding tension to the overlying abs. So if you normally go around tensing your abs by squeezing them like this, for whatever reason, perhaps to create core stability, another option is to pull the belly in to add tension to those abs, or if you like, a little bit of stretch. And that can cause the front of the hip bones to lift, the pubic bone, the A6, it can cause them to lift. At the same time, it can also cause the front of the rib cage to descend. So activating the transverse abdominis, pulling it inwards, can be used to add tension to the overlying abdominal muscles. It can also be used to help control, to a certain extent, the relationship between the front of the rib cage and the front of the hip bones. Now, if you have knee problems, certain knee problems, maybe minor knee problems, transverse abdominis activation may be helpful. Why is that? When the transverse abdominis is activated, as I said, it can be used to pull upwards on the A6 and or the pubic bone. And those muscles, from those bony reference points, if you will, so focusing on the A6, there are actually 3 hip flexors that attach at or near the A6. You have the rectus femoris attaching below the A6, running down the front of the knee to attach to the kneecap and the tibia. You have the tensor fasciae lati running from the ASIC to the IT band and from there down to the top of the tibia. You also have the sartorius, which runs from the ASIC across the front of the mass of the adductor behind the vastus medialis, and from there attaches to the top of the tibia just below the knee joint. So those three muscles, you could think of them as hip flexors, but they also, the sartorius on the inside and the tensor fasciae lata on the outside, they also help control shin rotation relative to the femur when the knee is bent. Another way you could think about it, those same muscles can help control hip flexion. But with the transverse abdominis pulled in and creating an upward pull on the ASICs, and one way to do that, you might want to lift your rib cage slightly or vary the height of the rib cage, but keep it still, pull the transverse abdominis in and thus generate an upward pull on the ASIC. With the ASIC having an upward pull, that creates more or less an anchor point for the hip flexors so that they can act effectively on the knee, whether flexing the hip joint, so that they can act effectively, whether flexing the hip joint or working on the shin. And it's not a guarantee that it will help knee pain, but it's sort of one of those things like changing the fuse or checking the fuses when a light doesn't work. If the light doesn't work, one of the easiest things you can do is check the bulb or check the fuse just to make sure those aren't the problems. And with knee problems, or a lot of problems, sometimes it's a simple matter of creating stability for particular muscles that seem to be hurting. And with knee problems, one of the simple equivalents of checking a fuse is making sure you're creating an upward pull on the ASIC so that the muscles, those hip flexor muscles, which also work on the knee joint to either extend the knee or help stabilize the knee or rotate the shin, or stabilize the shin against rotation. Make sure those have a firm, stable anchor point so that they can work effectively on the knee. And you may find in some cases that helps you to deal with some types of knee pain. So another thing that the transverse abdominis can be helpful with is dealing with back pain, possibly. And again, it's like the knees. It's one of those things where it's something simple that you can check. It might be a way of detecting imbalances in the way you position your rib cage relative to your lumbar spine, in the way you use your hips. Are they imbalanced? But basically, if you divide so simple way to think of the lower back, you could think of the lower back as three separate regions. You have the sacrum and the junction between the sacrum and the base of the lumbar spine. You have the lumbar spine itself, the three middle sections in particular. And then you have the top of the lumbar spine and the bottom of the rib cage, so the thoracolumbar junction. So those are three, I would say, rather critical areas of the lumbar spine. And while the middle part is important, the junction of the sacrum and the hip bones and the lowermost lumbar vertebrae and the hip bones, the SI joints, but also the top where the lumbar spine and thoracic spine meet. I'd say those are the two critical points. There can be a lot of stress at those points because at the top you have where the rib cage joins the lumbar spine. At the bottom you have where the hip bones attach to the spine. So you could imagine those are areas where it's possible for a lot of stress to occur and possibly lower back pain or be the cause of lower back pain. So what is this to do with the transverse abdominis? The transverse abdominis can have an effect on all three regions. The lower band attaches across the hip bones, and when it activates, it can resist the pelvic floor muscles to help stabilize the SI joints. It can also it can be used to help control sacral nutation and counter nutation. That's when the sacrum tilts back or forward relative to the hip bones at the same time, causing the front of the hip bone, the A6, to open or close, or the sitting bones to close and open. The upper band of the transverse abdominis crosses the front of the rib cage, and it in turn can be used with, say, the serratus posterior inferior muscles, which attach from the lower ribs to the top of the lumbar spine and the lowermost thoracic vertebrae, so round about here. So that muscle, the serratus posterior inferior, along with the upper transverse abdominis, that can be used to help stabilize the thoracolumbar junction, the place where the lumbar spine and the rib cage meet. Then you have the middle band of the transverse abdominis, and that can help work on the lumbar spine, on the middle section of the lumbar spine. And just as a note, when I've taken some time to try and draw anatomy, and it's a useful way to learn different relationships between the muscles. And one thing to note about the transverse abdominis is when it attaches to the lumbar spine, in the process of attaching to the lumbar spine, it actually passes behind a muscle called the quadratus lumborum. And that's a muscle that extends up from the hip bones to attach to the lumbar vertebrae, and also parts of it attached to the bottom rib. And it also has fibers that attach from the bottom rib and extend down to the lumbar spine. But the transverse abdominis passes behind that muscle before it attaches to the lumbar spine. And one thing, middle fibers of the transverse abdominis, when they activate, they may have a slight effect on the quadratus lumborum, maybe taking out some slack, making it easier for that muscle to activate, maybe not, but just something to bear in mind when thinking about the possible benefits of activating the transverse abdominis muscle.